I wasn't looking for anything unusual that afternoon. I was in the Detroit Historical Society archive, scrolling through photographs of the Great Fire of 1805. Just routine research. Just another day in a room full of old images and older silences. Then I noticed something. In a photograph dated 1806, showing a rebuilt storefront on Woodward Avenue, there was a doorway. Not remarkable in itself. But the doorway was elevated, roughly 3 feet above the current street level. The stone surrounding it was ornate, detailed. The kind of work that takes time. The kind of work you don't usually rush through. I kept looking. Other photographs showed the same pattern. Windows placed too high. Basement entrances that didn't make structural sense. Foundation stones beneath the rebuilt structures that seemed to belong to something else entirely. An archivist passing by noticed my focus. "We never figured out why they rebuilt quite so fast," she said. Just a comment. Casual observation. Most cities take years to recover. Detroit rebuilt in months. I looked back at the photographs. At the geometries that didn't align. At the rushed-over stonework. Something about this didn't sit right. I began to wonder if other people had noticed. If other people had asked these questions. If those questions had been answered somewhere, and the answers had simply disappeared. I started walking Detroit's oldest districts. Particularly the areas near downtown, where the fire had done the most damage. Where the rebuilding had been most accelerated. What I found was architecture that didn't make sense. Load-bearing walls in the wrong places. Windows asymmetrically positioned, as if built around obstacles that were no longer visible. Foundations that went deeper than necessary for the structures above them. Basement levels that seemed to serve no clear purpose but were clearly intentional. I compared Detroit to other old American cities. Philadelphia. Boston. New York. The patterns were different. Cleaner. More logical. Detroit's early architecture had a quality of adaptation. As if builders were working around something they'd encountered. I pulled early blueprints and sketches from the archives. The documentation from 1806 and 1807 showed something peculiar. Building permits that referenced settling and substructure assessment. Technical language for what? Newspaper fragments from that period mentioned it obliquely. References to workers discovering lower chambers. Mentions of previous work that had to be incorporated into new construction. One document used the phrase inferior construction beneath without explanation. I began mapping these anomalies. They weren't scattered randomly across the city. They clustered. Specifically in the downtown core. Specifically where the most intensive rebuilding had occurred. A pattern was emerging. Not obvious. Not definitive. But present. The question that began to form was simple. Why would an entire city's builders make identical architectural mistakes? Unless they weren't mistakes at all. Unless they were constraints. Working around something. Building within limitations imposed by what they found below. The Great Fire of Detroit didn't begin on its own. That's the history. But as I read the period accounts, I began to notice something different. The fire wasn't just destructive. It was revealing. Workers' journals from 1805 and 1806 described encountering structures as they cleared the rubble. Different architectural styles. Materials that didn't match local manufacture. Stone tiles with unknown markings. Ironwork that predated any documented construction in the area. One diary, belonging to a man named Jacob Ritchie, contained specific language. He wrote of finding tiles inferior and superior to current work both present, of workers discovering settled stone beneath the burned frame, and of encounters with masonry that predate settlement. These weren't the exaggerations of frightened workers. The language was observational. Technical. Precise. The institutional response to these findings was swift. City authorities organized the rebuilding with unusual speed. Within months, debris was cleared. Within a year, new structures were rising. But something else was happening simultaneously. Foundations weren't just rebuilt. They were pushed deeper. New buildings were constructed at a higher elevation than the previous structures. The city, quite literally, was being raised. I found a document from a city official written in 1806. He acknowledged the findings from workers. He acknowledged the unexpected discoveries beneath the burned areas. Then he made a recommendation to the city council, that these findings not complicate the rebuilding narrative and should be managed carefully to avoid public alarm. Managed. That word stayed with me. The buildings weren't just being rebuilt. The evidence of what lay beneath them was being sealed. Systematically. Deliberately. The city was being reconstructed on top of something, and that something was being consciously hidden. I began to understand. This wasn't forgotten history. This was managed history. I started cross-referencing newspaper articles from 1806 and 1807 with the city's official archives. What I discovered was disturbing in its clarity. Newspapers from that period referenced specific building permits, foundation surveys, architectural assessments, detailed records of discoveries made during rebuilding. But when I searched the archives for these documents, they didn't exist. Not lost. Not misplaced. Deliberately absent. I found a reference in an 1807 Detroit Gazette to a comprehensive survey of substructure conditions. The article cited specific findings. But the survey itself wasn't in the archives. It had been removed. Building permits from 1806 referenced in multiple newspaper accounts, gone. Architectural plans that workers had apparently submitted, absent. The pattern became clear only when I examined what was preserved. Historians from each generation noted fewer details than the generation before. Early histories mentioned unusual findings. Later histories mentioned settling. Contemporary histories mentioned nothing at all. Each generation inherited a less complete story. And each generation accepted what they were given. An archivist I spoke with confirmed it. There are gaps we've never explained, she said. Entire sections of records from 1806 to 1815 that simply don't exist. We've assumed they were lost in fire or flood. But honestly, we don't know. I realized something crucial. Silence isn't accidental when it's consistent. When absence becomes normalized, it becomes accepted. When absence is old enough, it becomes indistinguishable from truth. The question wasn't what happened. The question was who decided Detroit's history would be allowed to include. I began researching other cities. London, after the Great Fire of 1666. Architectural anomalies visible in rebuilding patterns. Foundation depths that seemed excessive for their era. Buildings constructed at unusual elevations. And in the records, similar gaps. Similar silences. St. Petersburg, built on marshland by Peter the Great. I'd always heard the explanation, engineering triumph over nature. But when I examined the architectural documentation, I saw something different. Foundation depths that defied logic for the period. Evidence of construction adapted to existing substructures. And Russian records from the early 1800s showing the same pattern, rapid reconstruction, historical gaps, institutional silence. Paris showed similar patterns. Berlin. Even Mexico City, built on the ruins of Tenochtitlan, had architectural anomalies in its colonial reconstruction that matched what I was seeing in Detroit. The pattern was global. The timeline was consistent. Early 1800s. Cities across continents. Different cultures. Different languages. Different institutions. Yet identical responses: rapid rebuilding, architectural adaptation, historical erasure. I started looking at maps. Old maps, predating these periods. Some showed more extensive infrastructure in these cities than official histories acknowledged. Roads and places later marked as undeveloped. Structures in locations that showed no sign of habitation in accepted timelines. Comparison sites began to reveal themselves. Not identical, but similar. Evidence of previous building cycles. Evidence of something that had been there before the official construction. The realization began to form. Detroit wasn't unique. It was part of something much larger. When I presented this pattern to academic colleagues, the response was consistent. Each city had independent reasons for rebuilding. Different catastrophes. Different engineering challenges. The pattern was coincidence, they said. Confirmation bias. Yet the pattern persisted. Across geographies. Across centuries. Across institutional boundaries. Strategic erasure followed by rapid reconstruction. Everywhere. I found 4 surviving written accounts from Detroit fire survivors and reconstruction workers. Their testimonies had never been systematically studied. They'd been scattered across archives, dismissed as unreliable worker accounts. But when I read them together, something became apparent. All 4 independently described the same elements. Chambers beneath the burned structures. Stone of different composition. Habitation previous to the fire. Layered construction suggesting multiple building periods. These weren't vague impressions. These were specific, detailed observations. The kind of thing people notice when they're working with their hands. Yet these accounts were dismissed in official histories. Relegated to footnotes or excluded entirely. Why? Because they came from workers. Not educated historians. Not institutional authorities. But here's what struck me. When multiple people independently describe the same thing using the same language, that's not exaggeration. That's reporting. I found a letter from a city official acknowledging these testimonies. He even validated the workers' observations. But then he made a critical recommendation. These accounts, while likely accurate in particulars, should not complicate our rebuilding narrative, as public knowledge of substructure conditions might discourage investment and settlement. Translation: the evidence was real. But it was inconvenient. The suppression wasn't because the testimonies were unreliable. It was because they were too reliable. They threatened the official story. And so they were managed away. Institutional authority doesn't need proof to be wrong. It only needs the power to determine what counts as evidence. I began studying not the history itself, but how history became official. How did Detroit's origin story get established? How did competing narratives get suppressed? Not through dramatic conspiracy, but through something more subtle. Through institutional incentives. Early histories of Detroit selectively quoted period documents. They included testimonies that supported the official narrative. They excluded those that complicated it. Later historians, trusting the work of earlier historians, inherited these selective collections. They never questioned what was absent because they'd never known it existed. The system was self-reinforcing. Once a narrative was established, institutional resources flowed toward supporting it. Funding for research that confirms the story. Grants for projects that reinforce it. Career advancement for scholars who don't question it. Contradicting evidence faced different treatment. Dismissed. Marginalized. Left unfunded. The problem wasn't conspiracy. It was structure. An institution doesn't need to destroy evidence. It only needs to not preserve it. It doesn't need to suppress truth. It only needs to not fund its investigation. I realized something unsettling. The system doesn't require intentional deception. It requires only that we accept established authorities without question. Once that acceptance is normalized, the suppression happens automatically. The gatekeepers of history aren't necessarily lying. They're protecting something. Narrative coherence. Institutional legitimacy. The stability that comes from accepted origin stories. But that protection has a cost. And that cost is truth. I began looking at geological evidence. Sediment samples from Detroit's subsoil showed anomalies. Layers that didn't match expected patterns for the region. Composition that suggested rapid deposition rather than gradual accumulation. Something had settled in Detroit's soil relatively recently in geological terms. Within the last few centuries. Historical accounts from the fire period mentioned something I'd initially overlooked. Mud. References to mud appearing during and after the fire. Not from the fire itself, but encountered by workers clearing rubble. Descriptions of unusual sediment conditions. Soil that seemed recently disturbed. What if the fire itself wasn't the reason for rebuilding? What if the fire was secondary to something else? I researched global environmental events from 1800 to 1820. Volcanic activity. Unusual weather patterns documented across multiple continents. Strange atmospheric phenomena recorded by observers worldwide. A geological episode that seemed to have affected multiple regions simultaneously. The timeline aligned. Early 1800s. The period when cities across the globe were rebuilding. The period when unusual sediment appeared in multiple locations. The period when records began to silence. I'm not stating this as fact. I'm presenting it as a framework. A possibility. Something that would explain both the mud mentioned in period documents and the architectural adaptations I'd observed. But when I mentioned this possibility to colleagues, something changed. The conversation stopped. Not because of scientific objection. Because I'd crossed a line. I was proposing something that challenged fundamental assumptions. The resistance itself became evidence. I began systematic comparison. European cities. Asian ports. American settlements. All showed similar patterns during the same decade. Not all had fires. Yet all showed accelerated reconstruction. Buried foundations. Gaps in records. Architectural anomalies suggesting adaptation to pre-existing conditions. The timeline correlation was undeniable. Anomalies clustered specifically around 1810 to 1815. Not spread randomly across decades. Concentrated in a narrow window. Geological documentation supported this. Unusual sediment layers across multiple continents dated to precisely this period. Not conjecture. Measurable, verifiable data showing rapid deposition of foreign material in multiple locations simultaneously. Period documents from multiple countries referenced unusual environmental phenomena. Japanese records mentioned strange weather. European observers documented atmospheric anomalies. Russian records described settling and geological disturbances. All from the same narrow timeframe. All acknowledging something unusual. The institutional response globally was consistent. Not coordinated, I found no evidence of international conspiracy. But consistent. Erasure happened everywhere. Suppression was universal. That consistency suggested something more troubling than conspiracy. It suggested fear. A response so automatic, so universal, that it didn't require coordination. It required only that institutions everywhere understood something needed to be hidden. I'm describing what I found. Not interpreting it. Not concluding. But the pattern is undeniable. Multiple continents. Multiple cultures. Multiple institutional systems. All responding identically to evidence of something that occurred during the same historical period. All suppressing documentation. All managing narratives. The question that lingered, what event could simultaneously cause rebuilding across continents without leaving clear documentation? What was so significant that it required global institutional silence? Why do societies suppress evidence of previous advanced civilizations? I began researching historical precedent. Civilizations that discovered evidence of earlier sophisticated cultures often suppressed it. Why? Because acknowledging previous advancement destabilizes current narratives. If an earlier civilization achieved sophistication, what does that say about progress? About development? About the legitimacy of current institutions? The psychology is protective. If established history is wrong about this, what else is wrong? The implications cascade. Authority becomes questionable. Origins become unstable. Suppression isn't always malicious. Sometimes it's protective. Of institutions. Of social order. Of the frameworks that hold civilization together. I discovered something crucial while examining this pattern. Selective memory functions as institutional survival mechanism. Not conscious. Emergent. The system protects itself automatically. Is it organized suppression? Or is it institutional behavior so normalized that it appears coordinated? Both possibilities are troubling. What matters isn't which one occurred. What matters is that it happened. And we accepted it. The realization lingered with me. If Detroit's history was managed, what other histories have been? How many civilizations have been erased not through destruction but through systematic non-preservation? How many peoples have been written out of history not through conspiracy but through institutional silence? The question expanded beyond Detroit. Beyond even these cities across the globe. It became a question about the nature of history itself. About what we're allowed to know. About who decides. Let me inventory what exists. Photographs showing architectural anomalies. Geological samples documenting unusual sediment layers. Period documents acknowledging discoveries. Survivor testimonies describing consistent details. Global patterns in reconstruction timelines. None of this proves anything definitively. Equally important, what's sealed? Basements beneath Detroit buildings. Foundation layers that remain inaccessible. Archives that require institutional permission. The deeper evidence remains literally underground. The problem is fundamental. The more thorough the suppression, the less accessible the evidence. How would one verify claims about a hidden civilization when that civilization's evidence has been systematically buried and built over? The paradox is unavoidable. We need access to verify. Access is controlled by the institutions that benefit from silence. Some buildings in Detroit have basements that go down further than their owners remember. City planners have prevented archaeological investigation in certain downtown areas. Archives remain closed or incomplete. Physical investigation is restricted. How much evidence was destroyed in the fire? How much was removed afterward? The distinction matters. But the distinction has been deliberately obscured. I cannot prove what I found. But I can document what remains. And what I've been prevented from finding. I'm left with questions. No conclusions. Questions that linger in the quiet spaces of archives and basements and silenced conversations. If this happened in Detroit, and similar patterns exist globally, what does that mean? How do we understand history when the mechanisms that create historical documentation systematically exclude inconvenient evidence? The specific questions remain unanswered. What were the structures survivors described? Why does the rebuilding timeline defy logistics? Why do multiple cities show identical patterns without recorded connection? What environmental event occurred in 1810 to 1815? To verify any of this, we would need access institutions have restricted. To investigate further, we would need permissions that haven't been granted. To understand fully, we would need records that don't exist. That absence itself is meaningful. I began investigating a fire. What I found was a silence. And I'm uncertain which is more troubling, what might have happened, or that we've constructed a system that ensures we can never know. History is not what happened. History is what we were allowed to know happened. It's a curated collection, not a complete record. It's institutional narrative, not objective truth. The architecture remains. The anomalies persist. The questions linger. In Detroit's oldest buildings, in those asymmetrical windows and elevated doorways and foundations that go deeper than necessary, the evidence waits beneath the new construction. If entire civilizations can be erased from records, what other history have we lost? And did we lose it, or were we made to forget? The door remains elevated. The stone remains ornate. The basement extends deeper than it should. And we walk past these impossibilities every day without asking why. That silence is the real architecture. The structure that holds everything in place. The structure we maintain without understanding what we're protecting or from what.